Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Monday, August the 28th, 2023. You're tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for joining. We're almost at the end of August, and there's lots and lots of stuff. There's no way that we're going to be able to get to everything in the news today. So I wanted to start off with, because it's close to the end of August, a story that we touched on very briefly before, and last Thursday, towards the end of the show, I said that I'd get into it tonight. It's not a long story, but it has to do with climate change. Yeah, I know. I can't not talk about climate change, right? And the whole argument about, how the earth is burning up, etc., and how the average temperature, we quote-unquote shattered these records for high average temperature on a few days, etc., world average temperature, etc., etc. So I thought I wanted to point out to you guys an interesting piece of information that puts all of the data that's been bombarding you, the listeners, for the past little while about the earth burning up. What was it that the UN Secretary General said? We are now in the age of boiling, global boiling. We've left the age of global warming, and now we're in the age of global boiling. And, maybe he was right if he was referring to people's tempers, not temperature, but tempers boiling over and over again, even when it's not justified because it happens to be hot outside. I don't know, but just a little bit of the silly season again this summer when it came to the whole climate change thing. We have wildfires in Canada, must be climate change. Yeah, actually, let me remind you of something we did cover a couple of weeks back, and that was that the government of Canada has just created a new office to determine whether or not global climate change is linked to whatever natural event there happens to be, whether it's extreme weather or wildfires, etc. And it just occurred to me that if you actually have to have an office to be able to examine the data and make that declaration at some point in time, as if it really needs to be made. But if the science is settled, as we're constantly being told, why do we need an office in order to examine this? Isn't the science already settled? That's what we're told over and over again. Anyway, I've gotten a little bit off track. What I really wanted to point out to you, ladies and gentlemen, was an interesting statistic here in Ottawa. And it's not just Ottawa, but it's in Toronto as well and down in around the Great Lakes. We had a hot, not an exceptionally hot July, but it was hot. I think based on my own experience, perhaps a little hotter than normal. A lot of humidity, and we had a lot of rain in the month of July. We had a lot of rain here in August as well, at least one particular storm. But the interesting piece of data that's not being reported, I saw one item in one news story about this on one of the weather networks. But here's the interesting thing. The city of Ottawa, and it's going to turn out to be this way for the city of Toronto as well. The city of Ottawa has not experienced so far in the month of August a temperature as high as 30 degrees Celsius. We have not reached 30 degrees Celsius at all for the month of August. Now, that isn't just rare, ladies and gentlemen. That is, in terms of record keeping, unprecedented. We are set, because for the next few days it's still not going to reach 30 degrees if the forecasts are to be believed. So we have not reached the temperature of 30 degrees once in the month of August in Ottawa. That's unprecedented. And not only is it unprecedented, but we are set, if everything holds, we are set to have the coldest high temperature average, the coldest highest temperature for the month of August ever since we started keeping records in Ottawa. The coldest, highest temperature. Now, what do I mean by that? Just to be clear, I mean that if the high temperature every day is whatever it is, the highest that the high temperature has been in Ottawa for the month of August looks like around 28 degrees Celsius. And it's going to be about that, it looks like, for Toronto. And also, this particular story that I was looking at says that it'll be probably about that in Hamilton, which means it's the same thing all around. Now, that's not being offered to you by me as a refutation of climate change, because, as I've said before, and thinking people know this, educated people know this, climate change is natural, it's real, it happens, end of story. The question is it man-made climate change? Do human activities contribute to climate change? I'm open-minded about that, but are we in the middle of a climate change crisis? And is all of this, as is being reported, caused by human beings? I don't think so. I'm more than skeptical. I've pretty much reached the conclusion where neither case is accurate. But hey, I could be wrong. As Winston Churchill used to say, I'd rather be right than consistent. So if you want to prove me wrong, prove me wrong. But that's really not the point. I'm not trying to make the argument that climate change isn't real or that it's not caused by human activity. I'm not trying to make a climate change argument here at all. I'm merely pointing out that the observed data here in Eastern Ontario and Southern Ontario doesn't support, for this year, the argument that climate change is affecting our temperatures. Global warming has not settled in August. Now, I know what you're going to say, or at least I know what our detractors on this question are going to say. They're going to come back and they're going to say, well, that's just weather. That's not climate change. And they're right. But the same argument goes for when you talk about having set a record high temperature as opposed to a record low high temperature. It's just weather. And all weather is local. So I promised that I'd talk about that tonight. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it. To me, it's not something that's worth dwelling on. We've talked about this before. I'm sure we're going to talk about it again as we move forward. But it is a little bit of information, a piece of data, statistics, knowledge that is important for you to know, because it puts all of the other news reports about dire circumstances into perspective. You know, if you were hearing this kind of report from time to time, along with the reports of higher temperatures, that would create a certain perspective, a certain balance, where you would say, well, temperatures go up, they go down, climate changes from one year to the next a little bit, weather changes from one year to the next, weather patterns change, some seasons are warmer, some seasons are hotter. If you were getting all of the information that's out there, that would be something that you would be saying. But you're not getting all of the information. You're getting only cherry-picked information that supports the catastrophism of the people who are saying that we have a climate emergency, and that we have to fundamentally change our economy, our culture, our way of life, because that ultimately is what's driving climate change. Okay, both of those are just bunk. Don't believe them, ladies and gentlemen. So, okay, I said I don't want to get onto this for the whole day, for the whole show. I have no intention of doing that. I just wanted to get it out of the way because I promised that I would, make mention of it. So, important information. Keep that, as it were, in the back of your mind for the next time that you are going to hear about how we had a record temperature in wherever, and in Kelowna, BC, or Vancouver, or whatever, I don't know. And it's interesting because, you always hear about the breaking a record high temperature. What you don't actually hear about is the day-to-day temperatures, which really are not excessively hot. I mean, newsflash, in the interior of British Columbia, it gets hot in the summertime. It gets hot here in the summertime. It gets much hotter here normally in the summertime, here where I am in Eastern Ontario, than we're currently experiencing in the month of August. Okay, so what else is happening in the world to talk about? Well, there are a few things. The Liberal Party here in Canada has just wrapped up its federal ministers' cabinet retreat in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. And one of the criticisms of this meeting is that they actually haven't come back with a plan to deal with the housing affordability crisis. Okay, that's something that we need to get into. And the reason we need to get into is this. The system right now that we have, housing is susceptible to all kinds of market forces. It's not isolated from the free market. There may be rules and regulations, etc. But what is really driving the housing prices, or the housing market, the affordability crisis, so-called? What's really driving it, ladies and gentlemen, is a supply and demand issue. We are not building enough housing in this country in order to supply the number of people that are coming into this country, both population growth indigenously, that is to say the people who live here already. I know there's this notion that indigenous means, First Nations. It really doesn't. Indigenous means the people who are living here. I was born in Canada. That makes me a native Canadian, quite apart from any other ethnicity issues that I might have in my life. So for the people who are born here, plus the people that we are bringing in on an annual basis, and we are not building enough housing for everybody. Now, I'm not talking about the homeless issue. There's a lot of things that contribute to homelessness. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. I'm just talking about the cost of housing and the, I don't want to say the out of control increase in the price of housing, but certainly the price of housing has gone up significantly, and salaries, earnings have not kept pace with it either. Now, there is a silver lining in that, and I think it's worthwhile just mentioning before we get onto the problem side of things and what the government is or is not doing about it. I have to mention to you, ladies and gentlemen, that for most people in this country who own a house, for them, housing is more than just a roof over their head. It's actually the biggest investment that they make. So they purchase a house, and the value of that house goes up over a period of time. That's savings. That's an investment. And so the fact that the price of housing is going up doesn't necessarily mean in every single case that it's bad. There are a lot of people who are benefiting from this. And I'm not talking about property developers, and I'm not talking about rich people and that who really, it doesn't matter to them that much. I'm just talking about middle-class people. I'm talking about the average Joe who has a mortgage, pays the mortgage on a monthly basis religiously, but the price of their house has gone up. Now, there are challenges that are attendant in the price of the housing going up, because that's going to be a problem potentially when you go to renew your mortgage. But, ladies and gentlemen, okay, I think that you have to remember that there are people, middle-class people, who are benefiting from increases in the value of homes. The people who are not benefiting from are people who are in the market for purchasing a home. Okay, that's a different story. So let's just remember that increased housing prices actually does help people predominantly in the middle class. Okay? Again, let me reiterate, I'm not dismissing the other side of the argument. I'm not dismissing the negative side. We're going to get to the negative side in a minute. But I just want to point out to you that it's not all negative. I want you to understand that. If you're just a middle class guy, mother, father, parents, single family home, okay, and maybe you're struggling to make ends meet, but you're making your mortgage payments every single month, okay, if the value of your home goes up, that's not a bad thing. Remember, when you make a mortgage payment, yes, you're paying the interest on the money, yes, you're paying back the principal, but you're also putting money into your equity in your home. And as the housing prices increase, that equity increases irrespective of how much of your mortgage payment, of what your mortgage payment is. And that's a good thing. It's savings. Okay, so let's just set that aside for a moment. And what we're going to do is we're going to go for our first break. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And we are back. You are tuned in to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Monday, August the 28th, 2023. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for joining and staying with us. We've been talking about the housing affordability crisis here in Canada, and the fact that what we just were talking about, very quickly to reiterate, that when housing prices increase, that's not a 100% bad news story. That's a good news story for the people who are in their houses, who have a mortgage, who are paying their mortgage. That's a middle class success story. And we would like to see housing affordable. We're going to get into that in a moment. But again, I just want to make sure that you understand that it's not all bad news. And the people who benefit the most from it are people in the middle class, or people who own their own homes, working class. All right. So that's the good news side of it. The bad news side of it, of course, is what about the people who want to purchase a house? and they can't afford it, or alternatively, maybe they can afford it, but they can't find one. And in this, we're also start getting into the whole rental issue as well. So let's just split those two things up for a second. Rental and purchasing. Purchasing, there are two problems with purchasing, two challenges. First of all is the cost of the house, and the second, of course, is interest rates. With higher interest rates, higher mortgage payments, irrespective of the cost of the house. And of course, that's going to hit people who are in their homes already that have to renew their mortgage. That's a challenge as well. Higher interest rates. And that's an inflation issue. And that's a separate item altogether. We're not going to get into that tonight. We've talked about it before. Maybe we'll do again. But let's set aside the inflation issue and the interest rate issue for tonight. There are important driving forces when it comes to the cost of housing, the cost of property. When you want to buy a house, what drives that? Well, market forces drive that. It's not, the price of housing in this country is not regulated. So, and we don't want it to be regulated, by the way. We do not want the government to step in and say that they're going to reduce housing prices by X number of percentage points or put a cap on things. We don't want the government to interfere in this. Okay? The free market has to act like the free market does. So what drives housing prices up in a free market? Well, frankly, there are two things. There's the cost of the development in the first place, the cost of construction to start with. That, ladies and gentlemen, is almost entirely government driven. Inflation has an effect on that, for sure, because construction items, the things, the building products that you need to build housing, the prices are affected by inflation in some things. So there's that. But really, the big issue is red tape and regulation. It takes too much time. It's too expensive to develop housing today. And that's 100% on the government. If governments are really interested in keeping the cost of increase, the actual cost of housing down, or reducing the cost of housing, then the very first thing that they should be doing is they should have, every municipality should have its own little, call it a blue ribbon commission that is responsible for looking at the process for getting permits, okay, from the moment a developer purchases the land to the point in time where there's shovels in the ground. How can we streamline that process? How can we eliminate red tape? How can we reduce the cost involved? How can we do all of that? There are a number of things that could be done. I'm not going to enumerate them here because every municipality is different, but when you talk about the developers have to pay for permits, they have to do a lot of other development in terms of building roads, sewers, etc. All of these things go into the cost of the housing initially when it's first developed, when the house is first built. You don't just build the house, you build the community around it. So there's an initial cost involved. What can be done to reduce that cost? I don't have all of the answers. On a case-by-case basis, I might have some suggestions, but that's the gist of it. Okay, when it comes to government, you have to look at what the government is doing to increase the cost and find ways to streamline the process, find ways to eliminate unnecessary regulations, find ways overall to reduce the cost of the original development. That's number one. Number two, that's nothing more that the government can do. The second thing that has to happen is we have to find ways to increase the supply of housing. And right now, when people are talking about increasing the supply of housing, they're talking about what the government can do to speed it up. They're not talking about reducing red tape, reducing regulation. They're talking about funding, subsidizing, finding ways to inject incentives into the housing development market in order to encourage developers to speed things up. Okay. And I think that is absolutely the wrong thing to do. We don't need more government interference, input. We don't need more government help when it comes to housing. We need less government when it comes to housing. We need fewer regulations. We need less subsidy. Get to that in a second. Okay? So, we don't want the government to be doing any kind of a housing program if that means that the government is creating some kind of a bureaucracy or some kind of a mechanism whereby developers are going to qualify for some kind of incentive payments from the government in order to perform their jobs better. Quite frankly, why would you have to get, if you're in a private business and you want to increase the profitability of your business, that's what you want to do, presumably. You don't need the government to be offering some sort of a subsidy in order to do that. The only incentive that government should be doing is backing out. And that's an across-the-board thing. So it's not even an incentive necessarily directed at developers. So you have to have the government getting out of the business. I don't want the federal government to do anything on housing, because whatever they do on housing is going to cost money, and ultimately that money's got to come from somebody. And if it's taxpayers that are paying for it, or it's developers that are paying for it, whoever, ultimately it's the consumer that's going to pay for it ultimately. And the more money you take out of consumers' hands, the less they can afford to make their purchases, whether it's housing or anything else. No subsidies. It's the wrong thing to do to solve this problem. It looks compassionate. It looks like we're helping, but all we are doing is continuing to prolong and exacerbate the existing problem. So, no to subsidies. No to direct subsidies, payments to help people to afford. And we're seeing this across the board everywhere now. Municipalities that are deep in red ink, that can't afford to do the basic stuff, coming forward now and saying, well, we're going to help people rent because they can't afford to rent. And I'm asking myself, look, I mean, I'm sympathetic, I understand, but do you understand that when people can't afford to rent, then there's a problem? The problem is, why is the rental market so out of whack with the ability of consumers to pay for rental property? And in 9 times out of 10, if not 99 times out of 100, if not 100 times out of 100, it's because the government somehow has interfered in the free market. And the more you give subsidies, whether it's subsidies to help people to buy a house or some sort of a subsidy to help people to rent, and I know what I'm saying here sounds very unfeeling, but I'm just talking right now about market forces. You increase the demand. The more subsidies you make available to consumers, the more you increase the demand for consumption. And it's not the problem. We don't need to increase the demand. We need to reduce the price. And in order to reduce the price, we need to increase the supply of housing, whether it's rental housing or it's housing for purchase. Now, here's something that is very, I don't know. politically incorrect. Now, we've said this already, so this is nothing new. Maybe you're hearing it for the first time from me, but it's not the first time I've said it. Certainly not on this show, ladies and gentlemen. And that is the number of people that we're bringing into this country. I am astonished that nobody seems to be making a connection between the incredible increase in demand that is simply, forget about subsidies, forget about incentives, forget about all that stuff, just by increasing the number of consumers, the number of people who are looking for housing, that in itself causes the price of housing to go up. It's simple market forces. And here's the thing, okay? For all of you quasi-socialists out there who think that you can escape the free market, you really can't. Government regulation, government interference distorts the market. It doesn't fix the market problems. We have to deal with reality, and especially in the rental market, because the problem with rental, there's a supply of rental properties in this country, in urban areas, and there's a range of prices. So you're having prices for people with lower incomes are going to pay lower rent. People with higher incomes will pay higher rent, or they'll look for a place that maybe is a higher standard of living, and they're going to pay higher rent for that. That's the way the system works. That's the way the free market works. The problem with the rental housing, again, just like purchasing, is that we are in a short supply for predominantly the lower rents. But again, it's because there are so many people that want to rent. And part of it is, of course, we're pushing people, higher interest rates, etc., are pushing people out of the purchase market and into the rental market. So that contributes, again, to an increase in the demand. But in this case, demand and supply, they're not 100% linked together. Because rents, they go up and down somewhat. But you don't really negotiate with a big landlord for rent. They give you the price. You qualify, you don't qualify. The real problem with the rental market is the lack of rental units, or a shortage of rental units. That's really the problem in the rental market. We're going to take a quick break, second break here. We're going to get back into that in a second, actually 2 minutes. So stay tuned. Don't go away. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And welcome back to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you for sticking with us. We've been talking about the affordability crisis in housing and various permutations of that particular problem. And I want to get into, while we still have time, because there's a couple of other items I want to get to tonight, and that is the whole rental thing. And look, I'm just going to cut right to the chase here. When you have a shortage of rental property, it's always 100% of the time because the demand is too high. It's not just an affordability issue. Affordability in rental properties may be somewhat of a problem because there are going to be people out there who can find rental vacancies at the higher range because there's going to be less demand for higher rent properties, but people can't afford them. But that's not really an affordability problem. The real problem is that we don't have a sufficient supply of rental properties to meet the demand. That's the real problem. And what's really driving that, ladies and gentlemen? Well, I've already acknowledged that part of that is being driven by the fact that there are people who find themselves being pushed out of the ownership market because they can't afford to pay their mortgages anymore because of the higher interest rates, or they can't afford to purchase the house that they want to purchase in the first place because of A, interest rates, and B, even more importantly, the actual cost of the housing. And the actual cost of the housing is affected by the supply and demand, etc. And the people who benefit the most from higher costs of housing are actually the people who own the houses. And that's mostly just middle-class people, mom and dad, single families. And for most people, that's the single biggest investment that they make, is they purchase a house to raise their family in. Now, there are people who are being pushed away from that market or pushed out of that market because of the high interest rates right now. And if you're in the housing market, you may find that you just can't find a place that's affordable because of the higher prices. So you end up looking at the rental market. And the problem with the rental market, as I said, is that the supply of rental properties has not in any way, shape, or form in this country at this moment. It is not coordinated. It doesn't match the demand. And the number one reason for this, ladies and gentlemen, and this contributes to the high cost of housing across the board, whether we're talking purchase houses or we're talking rental shortage, the number one reason is the number of people that we are bringing into this country. It's an immigration problem. It's a refugee problem. It's a an international student problem. Everybody's talking about the housing crisis for international students. Where are these students supposed to live? And the number I saw today was somewhere around 900,000 the government wanted to bring in students. And where are they going to live? Not all on campus. So they have to have housing. And they either can't afford it or they can't find it. And of course, they're students, so they're not looking for high-end housing. They're looking for low-end. They're looking for inexpensive. Look, I'm not anti-immigrant. I'm almost embarrassed to have to say that. I shouldn't have to say that. But I am only saying it because I happen to know that there are a lot of people out there that are going to hear this argument and they're going to say, oh, you're against immigration. You're an anti-immigrant. I'm not. Parents were immigrants. I am not anti-immigrant. What I am is I am a very passionate believer, strong advocate for coordinated, carefully thought out immigration policy that is carefully coordinated with the housing policies at the provincial and municipal levels. You cannot bring into this country more people than we're building housing for. And don't tell me the Ontario government, I saw an ad from the Ontario government today, we're building 1.5 or 1.4 million homes. Okay, no. You may be planning for it. You may think you're going to do it. It may be your target, but don't talk to me about having built 1.5 million homes until you've built 1.5 million homes. And will that 1.5 million homes in Ontario house the people who want to be housed? So you have that problem. Where is the coordination between the federal government that controls immigration and the provinces and municipal governments that develop housing? It doesn't exist in any kind of a structured, carefully thought out way. Oh, sure, there's some communication back and forth when that happens, but there is no real plan in place to ensure that our housing development meets the needs of consumers. That is to say, the number of people who are looking for housing, whether it's purchasing new houses or it's renting. And, you know, we have international obligations when it comes to refugees. Okay. I'm not saying we shouldn't take refugees, but I am saying that if we can only have 500,000 people coming into this country every year, then the more refugees we bring in, the fewer permits we should be issuing, visas we should be issuing for new immigrants. Unless we can increase the speed at which we're developing housing. And there seems to be, while there's talk of doing that, I don't know how big an appetite there is ultimately. And that's really the problem. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is we are allowing our population to grow at a rate that is far higher than we can sustain affordably given our current level of construction and development. Now, that problem can be solved. But the only way it can be solved is to allow the free market to operate. And we continue to interfere in the free market. And again, I cannot stress this enough. Every time you give a subsidy to help people to afford, you are increasing demand. So it's pointless to give a subsidy to help people to afford rent. I understand the motivation in doing it. But the issue with rent is not affordability. The issue with rent is supply for rental properties. And you could put people, ultimately you could put people who can't afford it, you could put people into higher cost rental units through subsidized rent. But ultimately somebody's got to pay for that. Ultimately somebody has to pay for that subsidy. And when you put that bill on the back of taxpayers, all you're doing is you are reducing their disposable income, which does nothing to contribute to a solution. In fact, it exacerbates the problem. I can't say this enough, ladies and gentlemen. Government direct interference in the housing market, whether it's through increasing the supply or increasing the demand for housing through poorly thought out immigration policy or whatever, government is a serious contributor to this. Okay. Oh, my goodness gracious. Looking at the time here, let's go for our last break, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes. A couple of other things we want to just touch base on before we wrap things up today. So stick with us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And we are back. You are tuned in to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Monday, August the 28th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for sticking with us. Let's shift gears, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think there's anything more I can say about the housing issue and how it's tied largely to the number of people that we're allowing to come into this country, except for me to reiterate one more time. I can't help it. I got this phrase in my head, the lady doth protest too much, methinks. And I don't want to be that lady that's protesting too much, but I do want to emphasize one more time, I am not anti-immigrant. I am pro-immigration. But your immigration has to be carefully coordinated with the development of housing and infrastructure in order to ensure that everybody who lives here, people who were born here or new Canadians, continue to enjoy the high level of service and standard of living that we have not just become accustomed to, but built over a lengthy period of time. And that's why people are coming here. They want to live the Canadian dream. Maybe the Canadian dream isn't exactly the same as the American dream. I know you hear that phrase a lot. But still, there is a dream, and the dream is that this is a decent place to live. And it still is. But the standard of living is constantly being eroded. And we're constantly seeing reductions in service and quality of service right across the board in everything. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is something that we don't want, and we don't need it. We can have compassion for refugees. Yes, let's let in the refugees who do come here, who can get here, okay? But let's not destroy our standard of living because we want to, I don't know. I don't even know what's really motivating the government when it comes to this kind of stuff. New Canadians deserve a protection of the standard of living that they have come here to enjoy as well. So let's not do things, take on policies that have an adverse effect. And that means not closing our doors, but having a more sensible immigration policy. All right. Oh, we're not going to be able to get to everything I want to talk about tonight. So I do want to talk about the Republican primary race in the United States, and in particular, comments made by one of the candidates, Vivek Ramaswamy, with respect to Mike Pence and what he could or could not have done on January the 6th, 2021. But we're not going to tonight. You're going to have to tune into the show tomorrow night for that. This is what we call in professional broadcasting a teaser. I'm teasing you. I'm telling you what we're going to think, or one of the things we'll talk about tomorrow night. And you'll be surprised by this. I guarantee you. I'm not going to go further than I have already. But you'll be surprised, maybe shocked, particularly if you are a Ramaswamy fan. So, we're going to talk about that tomorrow night. Make sure you tune in. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, the province of Saskatchewan, similar to what they've done in New Brunswick, the province of Saskatchewan, the government has promulgated a new policy or a policy adjustment when it comes to gender pronouns and transition, etc., and names in public schools in the province of Saskatchewan. This new policy requires that kids under 16 years old who desire to have a different pronoun or to go by a different name, that teachers have to have parental consent to do this, which means they have to consult with parents, which means parents have to be informed. This is not a bad thing. Unfortunately, everybody's going out of their minds. I should say not everybody, but everybody who is pro-trans, quote-unquote, rights are going out of their minds. And I hear parents, I've seen stories now over the past few days where there are parents of kids who are, quote-unquote, transitioning, who are coming out and saying this policy is wrong. And my first observation is, why are you complaining about this policy? You know what your child is doing, and you support it. So don't you think that you have a right to know? The opposition to this particular policy change, and it's such a minor change, and it is very much, I think, very good in terms of defending parental rights, but not just parental rights, parental responsibilities. This is not something that kids should be doing on their own and being supported by the bureaucrats without some kind of parental consultation and parental input. Remember, kids are kids, and maybe they might be 14 or 15, so they're not really children anymore, but they certainly are not adults. And we have to stop treating them like adults. We have to talk about them. The real transition here is that they're transitioning between child and adult. But that's a journey. That doesn't happen overnight. And the responsibility to guide them in that journey is 100% the responsibility of their parents. Full stop. So there is never a reason and never an excuse for not informing the parents, unless somehow or other there is evidence that the parents are going to be abusive to the child. And by abusive, I don't mean that they're going to try to talk them out of it. I don't consider that to be child abuse. I mean, if a parent is so crazy that they're going to beat the kid silly because of it, well, that's a problem. And of course, so you have to take these things one step at a time. But there is never an excuse other than the most extreme, rare example where you would not want the parents to be involved in this. It's not the right of the bureaucracy to parent the kids this way. And this is just, for the opponents of this policy change, I mean, this is such a sensible, easily defensible thing. It's absolutely the right thing to do, and you have to be an extreme, idiotic ideologue to be arguing that this is wrong as a matter of principle. But when you talk about this being somehow or other transphobic, gosh, I mean, that's just plain idiocy, ladies and gentlemen. And parents across the country, but particularly in the province of Saskatchewan, need to stand up and they need to say, we support our government on this policy. It is not transphobic. It is not homophobic. It is nothing more than keeping parents informed about what's going on important, profound decisions that their children are making in school. You know, if a 14-year-old child came to a teacher and said, I'm having suicidal thoughts, would the school refuse to inform the parents? I'm being bullied. Would the school, on principle, refuse to inform the parents? It's really, when you get down to it, it's kind of shocking when you think about it, that somehow we believe that we need to have a policy in place to keep parents informed about what's going on in their children's lives when they're at school. That should just be something that happens naturally. There's something twisted in our system with the bureaucracy that we actually have to give them a directive to inform parents when something like this happens. I can't say anything more than that. Now, we might get into this a little further as time goes on, but for the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, don't be fooled into thinking that this is anything more than a sensible keeping parents informed about what's going on with their kids policy. It's not transphobic, it's not homophobic, it's not any phobic. It's good common sense. It's respectful of parents, and quite frankly, given the role that parents are supposed to be playing in guiding and raising their children, it's respectful of the children. And you parents in Saskatchewan need to step up and support the government on this. It doesn't really matter what else, what your political persuasion is. This is not a political partisan issue. This is a common sense, sensible, respecting parents and respecting children, or respecting the relationship between parents and their children and between children and their parents. That's what the issue here is, ladies and gentlemen. All right, I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and what do we want to do right now as we get closer to an hour, which is what we do for this show? Let's get into this week in history. What has happened on this day in history? Okay, so on August the 28th, 1963, Civil Rights March in Washington. On this day in 1963, somewhere around 250,000 people marched on Washington, D.C., which was to be the high point of the civil rights movement, and it was the day that Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous speech in which he uttered the words, "I have a dream." So on this day, August 28th, 1963, was the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King. I believe that was at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Also on this day, in 1996, the 15-year marriage of Prince Charles, then Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, and Diana, Princess of Wales, came to an end. Their divorce was finalized also on this day in 1996. Very unfortunate turn of events for the royal family at that time. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to the end of another frenetic show. As always, check out the website, www.josephbenamy.com. All one word, without the hyphen. While you're there, don't forget to sign up for free email updates. Notice I said the word free. Free, free. They cost you nothing. And we do not share our information with anyone else. While you're there also, if you happen to deal with Amazon, click on the link underneath the video player on the front page to make your Amazon purchases, whether you're in Canada or in the United States. It doesn't matter. There are 2 links there. It costs you nothing. Again, it's free. You get to do everything from your own account. It's just the portal that takes you to Amazon, and you go about by your business just the way you always have in the past. Costs you nothing, but it does help us to keep our show free for you, the listeners. Okay. Well, we will catch you tomorrow night, as always, here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Good evening. God bless. And whatever else you do, do not drink the Kool-Aid. All right. Good night. God bless. We will catch you tomorrow night here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show.